Shalom and warm welcome to the Middle East Report. In this program today, we will be discussing the decision made by some European countries to unilaterally recognize a Palestinian state, and we'll be discussing what are the dangers of a Palestinian state, not only for Israel, the Middle East, and also the world. Warm welcome to the programme, and I have two very special guests. They're all very familiar to you, as you'll see. So I'm joined today by Hugh Kitson from Whose Land, the famous Christian documentary filmmaker, together with Robin Benson. So gentlemen, welcome to the programme. I know that you guys have worked together and worked quite closely together, but literally this is your first appearance ever on the Middle East Report. So let's see how this dynamic works, and it's great to have you guys on the programme. Hugh, on behalf of our viewers of Revelation TV and the Middle East Report, we all want to thank you, and we have a debt of gratitude to you for what you've done, and with the Lord's help, of producing so many documentaries over the decade that have educated Christians in the church regarding the importance and significance of Israel. And if it wasn't for your work with Lance Lambert, I wouldn't have an understanding of Genesis 12, 1-3, that I will bless those who bless you and I will curse those who curse you. And being a broadcast journalist, I can't tell you the amount of times where I've seen that blessing or curse come into action. And particularly your recent project with Whose Land as well has really brought comfort to the Jewish community. It's brought comfort to Israel. You've reminded Israel and the Jewish people of who they are and their history. So in Hebrew, kol hakavod. So we will very much miss you. And Noreen, when you go off to Australia in the summer, and I think it's Australia's blessing and our loss, but we just want to thank you so much for what you've done, and I'm sure that our viewers have appreciated all the films they've seen that you produced, all that you've done over the decades, and kol hakavod, well done.
Thank you so much, Simon.
So I appreciate that. Robin, do you want to share what it's like to work for Hugh Kitson? All the good stuff, all right? All the good stuff. But no, share with them what it's like to work with this visionary.
Well, I mean, Hugh, I was thinking back as Simon was going through that introduction.
Yes.
I think the first time that we sort of connected was over
The Forsaken Promise.
Forsaken Promise.
Yes.
When I was working for Christian Friends of Israel, and you gave me all the constituent parts for the wraparound that went into the DVD case to reconstitute it again for the British edition. And I have to say that documentary, I remember you showing it at a CFI conference, annual conference, and it just blew me away because I had no idea of this terrible past history that this nation had with the Jewish people. And it just opened my eyes to a completely different aspect and understanding of how God works with nations in relation to his own people and so on. And it was the beginning, yes, of a working relationship, but it was the beginning of a friendship that has continued on to this day.
Yeah.
So I'm forever grateful that God had me working with CFI at that particular moment in my life, and in Hatikva's history that is now morphed into Whose Land.
Excellent. And recently you had you've been in Australia where you've been screening Whose Land. Do you want to share with us how that went, and how are the Australians taking to your film Whose Land? And I mean, it's quite a small Jewish community there, and they feel like they're at the other end of the world, but they play a major role in terms of Jewish advocacy for Israel.
They certainly do. And the Australian Jewish community, in some ways, is the most pro-Zionist community in the diaspora. It is small. Because Britain closed the doors of Palestine, as it was then called, after the Holocaust, many Holocaust survivors from Europe really had nowhere to go. And Australia was actually the first country to open their doors to Holocaust survivors. And so Melbourne has actually had the highest population of any city in the world of Holocaust survivors outside of Israel itself. And they tend to be very pro-Zionist. But whose land, actually we had help from the Australian Jewish Association in raising funds for this film. And I'm eternally grateful. Funnily enough, even though I've got strong connections with the Jewish community here in the UK, my connections with the community out there are actually far stronger. And they're very touched by this because the history of Israel is littered by the telling of lies by the nations. Douglas Murray wrote a brief review of Whose Land, and basically at the beginning of the review he said the nation of Israel has been lied about ever since 1948, and that is so true. And Whose Land, as Richard Kemp once put it, sets out to tell the truth, and that's really what it's all about.
And do you also want to share how the recent screening in London went, in North London to a Jewish constituency? Because I think it's really telling that when Christians make films and documentaries about the history of Israel and the Jewish people that touches them, it does have a profound impact. It
does. By the way, it was just before I answered that particular question, we had Richard Kemp out in Australia with us as well. And he's outside of the screenings of Whose Land. He spoke to schools, universities, even went to Sydney University where there was an encampment there and engaged with some of the protesters. And it has been a comfort to the Jewish community there, because anti-Semitism out there, and when I lived there in the 70s, 80s and 90s, anti-Semitism was almost unheard of. But it's as rampant there as it is here. And we've had a similar reaction here in London when we showed it at the end of last month. And Natasha Hausdorff, who you've probably seen a lot of on your television screens, she has been a wonderful advocate for Israel, and she's got this very sharp legal mind. Well, she and I did a Q&A on that occasion, and it was just a wonderful, wonderful evening. And the Jewish community are very touched to see Christians standing up for them, because the core production team of Whose Land is all Gentile.
Excellent. So let's have a look at a little bit of an insight into one of the latest in the series of documentary films produced by Hugh Kitson, Whose Land, and this does star Colonel Richard Kemp.
The documentary film Whose Land is not intended to justify the right to exist of the State of Israel. I find such an argument abhorrent. Questioning Israel's right to exist is pure anti-Semitism. Such fundamental prejudice should not be dignified by a response or contrary argument. How often is the right of Great Britain to exist called into question, or the United States, Germany, France, China, Russia, India, Saudi Arabia, Iran, any other country? How often is the right to exist of any country other than Israel questioned, argued over, debated, discussed? To do so is exceptional. Exception applied only to the Jewish state. It therefore amounts to anti-Semitism, pure and simple. In Nazi Germany, the right of Jews to own businesses, to own property, to join the professions, to go to school, to receive medical treatment, to live a normal life in the community, all of these were denied them. Today, Israel's enemies demand that the Jewish state be isolated, ostracized, banished from the community of nations. These people are the Nazis of the 21st century. Their arguments must not be dignified with a response. These modern-day Nazis are responsible for the greatest slur campaign in the history of humanity, spreading false narratives, falsifying and distorting history, lying, deriding, rejecting and despising without cause and for one purpose, to abolish the nation state of the Jewish people, Israel, whose land simply tells the truth, a truth that is clear, undeniable and unequivocal, a truth that for the sake of human civilization and decency must be heard above the growing cacophony of those who clamour to turn the world against the Jewish state, and whose false propaganda not only maligns the innocent and brainwashes the unwary, but also incites violence and inflames hatred. Join me, Richard Kemp, in the two-part documentary film Whose Land, as we uncover the true story behind the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Thanks to the work of Hugh Kitson, who's in the studio here, we can have a greater understanding of the conflict between Israel and the Arab states, but also understand Israel's legal right as a state and also Israel's history, which is so important. Robin, it's great that Israel has such an ally in Colonel Richard Kemp and his ability to speak up and defend Israel, particularly as he was the commander of British forces in Afghanistan. So when he talks about military matters, it has weight. But just share with us your thoughts on, I think as the weeks and the months go by with Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza, we're finding that Israel is increasingly internationally isolated, whether that's in the diplomatic arena, whether that's on the media, finding that she has very few friends. Share with us your thoughts on the way that Israel is currently being demonized around the world, particularly on social media and other platforms.
Well, I think this is one of the greatest battles that we face today, because anybody and everybody, if they've got a mobile phone, a tablet, can be a commentator on current events. And you know as well as I do, Simon, that if people have got a considerable following, then it just goes out like spider's web all over the world very, very quickly. If someone has a negative comment to make about what's happening in Gaza or up on the Lebanese border or internally in Judea and Samaria, it's out there before Israel can even react to it. And we have seen social media become the catalyst for this ongoing campaign of marches and demonstrations, this gathering together of students on campuses worldwide. That's what's driving this hatred of the Jewish people. I won't even use the word anti-Semitism any longer because it's an antiseptic technical term. We are talking about the hatred of the Jewish people that is spewing out, not of only the mouths, but on the fingertips of people who are using social media. The reverse side of that is that many of these people are actually getting their information from the same social media sources. They're not even bothering with the major news outlets, although you and I, the three of us, know that most of those are biased against Israel anyway. But if they're getting the sort of stuff that we know is out there, that again spewing out this vile hatred of the Jewish people, and that's the only source of information that they're getting, you begin to understand why people have bought into all of these lies, because they're not prepared, A, to think that maybe there's another point of view, and they're not prepared to go and investigate to see if there's another view. And so we're living with this situation where 24/7, anybody who has a passing interest in what is going on in the Middle East is bombarded with this negativity and this hatred.
Hugh, when it comes to Israel, aren't we seeing double standards? Primarily because, the world's media is not putting the Ukrainians under a microscope in how they're fighting their just war against the Russians. And we know what happens to Russian soldiers if they're caught by Ukrainian soldiers. There is no human rights for them. There is no Geneva Convention. And yet when Israel is facing a genocidal terrorist organization in Gaza that use asymmetrical warfare, i.e. women and children as human shields, and Israel is so careful to avoid civilian casualties, Israel's war is under a microscope. And Israel is held to higher standards than any other nation when it comes to conducting warfare. Share with us why you think that's the case.
Well, I think it boils down to hatred of the Jewish state. I mean, the IDF go to extraordinary levels to try and minimize civilian casualties. Now, to give you an example, when the British and Americans were fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq, the number of civilian casualties were at least 5, sometimes 8 for every combatant that was killed. Now, Richard Kemp, who has been in Gaza for most of the time since this war has started, has done calculations that actually it is less than 1 civilian casualty for every terrorist that's killed. And the other side of it is that Hamas is doctoring the number of casualties. They don't distinguish between combatants and innocent civilians, and they're using their own population as human shields. Now, none of this is reported in the media. In any other conflict, this sort of thing would be. Now, Assad of Syria, he's murdered hundreds of thousands of his own civilians, and yet the media don't take the slightest bit of notice. He murders Palestinians in refugee camps, and you get one Palestinian or a family that is killed by Israel, and the media just go absolutely berserk, and that's a very good example of double standards. So, and it really does, it boils down to hatred of the Jewish state, and if any civilians are killed, then of course, and it's tragic that they are, by the way.
Absolutely.
It is tragic. Israel is pilloried for it.
And just share with our viewers, Robin, how much the Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza is a war for survival, and how what happened on October the 7th posed an existential threat to Israel's existence, because we saw that Hamas breached the Eretz crossing, which for Israelis was unthinkable. I don't think anyone in the IDF would have thought that Hamas could have done that. And when they did, they carried out the biggest massacre of Jewish people since the Holocaust, which 1,200 were murdered, many of them brutally, many of them had their limbs amputated and cut off. I mean, crimes against humanity. So share with us the importance of why Israel needs to destroy Hamas and actually win this war, because if she doesn't, Israel's long-term survival as a nation state is surely in jeopardy and threat. We know spiritually that Israel's not going anywhere, but this does rely the strategic importance of destroying Hamas.
Yeah, and you raised an interesting point, an important point. Because what we're witnessing in real time, in human time and space, is a spiritual battle that is going on behind the scenes and has been going on since time began. We are seeing that worked out in reality in what is going on in Israel in the present day. And if anybody doubts that the Hamas organization or the Palestinian Islamic Jihad or the Palestinian Liberation Organization or any of these other affiliated groups don't want, if anybody doubts that their main aim is the destruction of the Jewish state and the annihilation of the Jewish people, all they've got to do is go to their English-speaking website of any one of these organizations and look at their charters. Hamas charters clearly states it exists for the destruction of the Jewish state and the annihilation of the Jewish people. And of course, behind Hamas, we've got the Iranian regime in Tehran, who there's not a week goes by but somebody from that regime doesn't pop up somewhere on social media or some media organization saying we are out to destroy this cancer, and that's Israel in the Middle East. So you have genocidal, there's no other word for it, terrorist organizations that are more or less surrounding Israel on three sides, and their prime purpose is to see the Jewish people destroyed and the state destroyed an Islamic state set up on that strip of land at the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. This is their sole aim. That's all they exist for. You remember within a week or so of October the 7th, we had Hamas leaders saying, we will do this 1,000 times,
absolutely,
10,000 times. So they are not going to give up. And the only way that Israel is going to ensure that October the 7th doesn't ever happen again is to destroy Hamas. Now, you will not destroy an ideology, but you need to destroy the actual people who are implementing that ideology. You need to take them out of the equation before you can even start to attempt to rebuild a society that is based on something a little bit more normal and some sense of civilization.
Absolutely. So let's have a look at this excellent news report from our friends at CBN that looks at how Israel has made a strategic breakthrough in the war against Hamas in Gaza by capturing the Philadelphia corridor.
The nearly 9-mile Philadelphia corridor was intended to prevent weapons and ammunition smuggling into Gaza. After taking control of territory this week, Israel found evidence it's been a pipeline for Hamas's war on Israel.
Our operations in Rafah have confirmed the intelligence that compelled us to operate in Rafah in the first place. Hamas turned the Philadelphia route into a central Hamas hotbed of terror.
Among the discoveries, rockets for attacks on Israeli civilians.
Dozens of rocket launchers with rockets inside ready to be fired at Israeli homes next to the border with Egypt.
They also found a nearly 8-mile subterranean network of about 20 tunnels with explosives, grenades, and AK-47s inside. Hagari says Hamas is also holding hostages there.
Hamas is holding our hostages in living hell across our border in Gaza, including in Rafah.
Hamas released a new hostage video this week, putting more pressure on Israel to make a deal. The White House says a new proposal is on the table.
And I can tell you that the Israelis are fully supportive of this fresh proposal, and as before have been willing to deal in good faith on this.
Meanwhile, Israel is signaling the fighting is far from over. Benjamin Netanyahu's national security advisor, Tzachi Hanegbi, pointed to the latest discoveries as evidence that Israel's incursion into Rafah is justified despite international opposition. He also told Israel's public radio that fighting in Gaza would continue for at least another 7 months through the end of 2024. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Excellent report there by our friends at CBN. Hugh, having visited the southern Israel after the horrors of October the 7th, and particularly kibbutz near Oz, and seeing one of the car parks with the cars destroyed by Hamas in Gaza, and driving past the Nova Music Festival, the site of it, and when you see the absolute devastation, the big question that comes to mind when you see all this is, why isn't Egypt being held responsible? And the fact now that Israel's discovered like tunnels the size of motorways going from the Rafah crossing in Egypt into Gaza, and we've also found, according to reports, that Hamas also have some American military technology as well. Isn't Egypt partly to blame for what happened October the 7th, because the amount of weapons that were smuggled in from Egypt into Hamas in Gaza, which had the weapons then to carry out the horrors of October the 7th?
I believe that Egypt is really quite complicit in the whole thing. Carolyn Glick wrote a very good article, and General El-Sisi, who is the president of Egypt, he has under the table really quite close links with Hamas. Now, their relationship with Qatar is fully mended, having been severed some years back, and he's keeping Hamas in one sense at a distance, but he's certainly cooperating. And one would think that the American administration would be putting heavy pressure on Egypt to take Gazan refugees. I mean, the simplest way of clearing Gaza of civilian population will be to set up refugee camps across the border in Egypt itself, in northern Egypt. Of course, one would have to contain them, because if you've got Hamas members among them, they just go and create havoc in other parts of the country. But actually, Egypt has, she signed a treaty with the African Union some 40 years ago, I believe it was, that obliges her, this is Egypt, to take refugees from any of the surrounding countries where there's war going on. And one would think the American administration would insist on this. So something is going on. Egypt is not the friend that Israel has assumed Egypt to be. And there's even been a threat, I understand, to dissolve the treaty that goes back to 1979, to break that treaty.
Wow. That's quite significant, but I think this does need examining.
Yes.
Because without that help and compliance from the Egyptians, or maybe it was Egyptian soldiers being bribed huge amounts of money to allow that smuggling of weapons and arms into Gaza that Hamas used on October the 7th. Without those weapons, Hamas couldn't have did what they did on October the 7th.
Absolutely.
So we have to take this into equation. Moving the programme on a little bit now Robin, what do you make of the fact that we've had the Irish governments, the governments of Norway and Spain, have come out to actually recognise a unilateral Palestinian state? Does nothing on the ground, but what it does show is that these nations, European nations, are rewarding Hamas for its terror atrocities on October the 7th. And again, this policy of appeasing the Islamists' lobby in order to call for a Palestinian state.
Yeah, I mean, it's disturbing. I think actually today, Slovenia has gone down the same route. I know Slovenia is not a major nation in the overall scheme of things, but it's a domino effect. And I think what has happened with these three making such a public gesture of promoting this idea and then going ahead with it, it has probably sparked other governments who have been considering this for some time to begin to go down the same route. But it's not, I mean, it's predominantly bad news, but it's not all. I mean, you've got Denmark, who have voted that they weren't, and as far as I understand, Hungary has said that it will not recognise it. Just in the last few days before we recorded this, the Australian government voted against going down that route. So it's joining several other nation states who have said no, but the majority of all of the nations in the world are going down that route. And what it does is just add another layer of isolation on Israel and the Israeli government. It's pushing them further and further away from the international community. But what it also, as you've already alluded to, it's rewarding terrorism. And it's placing the Palestinian Authority, such as it is, in the position where, okay, we don't have to negotiate. The rest of the world, for the most part, is recognizing us as a state, even though we have none of the criteria that the United Nations has set for the recognition of a legal recognition of a state. But nevertheless, to tell the Palestinians, we don't have to negotiate. We can just allow this to go on, or we can keep feeding into this hatred and this desire for destruction, and we're winning. In that sense, we're winning that battle, that diplomatic, that political battle.
Yeah, absolutely. And Hugh, as you've done so many documentaries on Whose Land, looking at the historical and legal claim to the land of Israel, what probably the Irish government, what the Norwegian government, even the Spanish government, or even maybe our own foreign minister, David Cameron, but we don't know how long the Conservatives will be in office or where they'll win the next general election, because we're in the midst of an election campaign. It is the fact that you cannot recognise a Palestinian state or agree to a Palestinian state outside of the legal international framework, which is the Oslo Accords. And it's up to the Israelis and the Palestinian authorities to come to a peaceful settlement themselves. And however much you don't like what's going on, you can't then put pressure on Israel to concede a Palestinian state or to recognise a Palestinian state outside of a negotiated settlement. So we actually find, aren't we, that likes of Norway, Ireland and Spain are actually breaking international law by recognising a Palestinian state.
Absolutely, I'd entirely go along with that. First of all, the Palestinian Authority does not qualify, according to the Montevideo Convention, does not qualify for statehood in the first place. The second thing is that Israel has full legal rights, and we cover this in detail in Whose Land, full legal rights of sovereignty over all of Judea and Samaria, and especially Jerusalem. So if the nations impose a Palestinian state on Israel's biblical heartland, it would be a complete violation of international law, because in Whose Land we show very solidly that Israel has every right. And so Israel has to agree to it. If I can make one other point.
Of course, please do.
Here I'm actually going to point the finger at Israel. Back in the book of Deuteronomy and in the book of Joshua, the Lord commands the Israelite leaders, Moses, Joshua, to possess the land. Now, in 1967, June 67, in the war there, they were handed Judea and Samaria and Jerusalem on a plate, if you like. And I believe that that would have been the point. They did, of course, very quickly declare sovereignty over Jerusalem. And that, of course, is highly contentious today. But with Judea and Samaria, had Israel actually exercised full sovereignty then you wouldn't have this vexatious situation where Israel is now being faced with possibly having to concede that territory to a hostile terrorist state and a threat to her own existence.
I mean, you could also go back and say that the fruits of this are the start of the Oslo Accords. I know that was the kind of legal and political framework to bring about the peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians or Palestinian Arabs. But the fact is that it was the Oslo Accords that brought in Yasser Arafat and the PLO. They were out in the cold. They were politically isolated for their support for Saddam Hussein in the first Gulf War. They were hated by the rest of the Arab states. They were consigned to Tunis, where they were isolated. They were running out of money. They were on the verge of bankruptcy. And yet, what did Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres do when they won the election in Israel in 1992? They gave Arafat a lifeline, believing that he could enforce a police force in the biblical heartland of Israel, which is Judea and Samaria, wrap it up into a kind of peace process and saying we're doing this for peace, when effectively this was a unilateral withdrawal from Israel's biblical heartland that Israel gained in a defensive war in the Six-Day War. So surely we can actually say the origins of the conflict and everything we're seeing now is that was disastrous decision to allow from the Israeli government and under international law to recognise Arafat as the sole representative of the Palestinian people.
It was a Trojan horse. Israel allowed a Trojan horse into her biblical heartland, and today, sadly, is paying the price for it. Only God can rescue that situation, I believe.
Absolutely. So let's have a look at this very good and, of course, excellent report by our friends at CBN. And shame to the Irish government, shame to the Spanish government and the Norwegian government for recognising a Palestinian state. Even though this would endanger Israel, this would endanger Jordan and the rest of the Middle East and actually reward Islamist terrorism, not only against Israel, but against the West.
Today, Ireland, Spain and Norway announced they will recognise a state of Palestine.
Each of us will now undertake whatever national steps are necessary to give effect to that decision. In the lead up to today's announcement, I've spoken with a number of other leaders and counterparts, and I'm confident that further countries will join us in taking this important step in the coming weeks.
Hamas called the decision an important step, while Israeli Foreign Minister Israel Katz said it is giving a prize to Hamas and Iran. And he recalled Israel's ambassadors to Norway and Ireland. The European countries' announcements came after this week's decision by the International Criminal Court to consider arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. On Tuesday, Norway declared if warrants are issued, they will enforce them and arrest Netanyahu and Gallant. On Capitol Hill, a bipartisan group of U.S. senators say they'll take action against the ICC, and the House of Representatives is working on a bill to sanction the court. Netanyahu warned that other democracies will be affected and told ABC the ICC prosecutor is pouring gasoline on the global fires of anti-Semitism.
Because he is attacking the one and only Jewish state and trying to handcuff us, preventing us from exercising responsibly through the laws of war as we obey them and we are subordinate to them. He's saying we're not. He's creating false symmetry, false facts, and he's doing a grave injustice to the International Court.
On the battlefield, the White House says it is satisfied with Israel's scaled-down military plan to invade the last major Hamas stronghold of Rafah. The IDF already reportedly controls about 30% of the city and more than half of the strategic Philadelphia corridor. This area contains smuggling tunnels used by Hamas to resupply its ammunition and weapons. Further north, the U.S.-built pier is bringing in aid to Gaza, but most of the aid is being stolen soon after it leaves the pier, and the Pentagon says none of that aid has reached the people in Gaza. On the diplomatic front, a major issue is still what will happen in Gaza after the fighting is over. Netanyahu says the Palestinian Authority will not control Gaza after the war. The Biden administration is pressing Israel to accept a deal normalizing relations with Saudi Arabia in exchange for some form of Palestinian involvement in Gaza after the war.
So interesting, isn't it? We have nations like Ireland, we have nations like Norway and Spain that instead of aligning themselves with a one true democracy in the Middle East that has a freedom of speech, has democratic institutions, is ruled by the rule of law, they'd sooner side with genocidal terrorist organisations like Hamas. Shame on them. I want to talk about Ireland a little bit, the Republic of Ireland, because Ireland's a great country. It's got a great Celtic heritage, and the Irish people are such nice people. And yet, what we see is with their consistently government, ever since really that the IRA aligned itself with the PLO, they have seen themselves as one of the biggest nations that support the Palestinian cause, and of course they want to be at the center of this. They want to support the recognition of a Palestinian state, the demonization of Israel in their media, in their parliament as well. So it's very tough not only to be Jewish in the Republic of Ireland, but to be a Christian Zionist as well is particularly difficult. Just share with us how difficult you think it is to advocate and support for Israel in the Republic of Ireland right now, particularly when we know that their government is conducting policies that are so outrageous.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Jewish community is small in the Republic of Ireland, but it is really beleaguered at the present time. I mean, this is what I hear from one or two friends. And again, the pro-Israel, whether they're Christian believers or not, again, is up against a brick wall, fighting against this government that, as you pointed out, for several iterations of successive Irish governments has taken this line of being pro-Palestinian. And it's hard to understand. Other than you got the whole issue of humanistic thinking that has crept into so much of Western civilization and controls ideas, policies, all the rest of it. So you've got that factor within the government of the Republic of Ireland. But I think, Simon, we have to realise too, we have to bring in the spiritual element.
Absolutely.
And you have a group of people in the Republic of Ireland. I don't know what proportion of the population stand behind their government and the stance that it's taken, but they have believed lies, okay? And as far as I can see from the scriptures, that the more you believe lies, the more you take on delusion, the more you're given over to it. And it seems like many Western nations have either reached a tipping point or have actually gone over the tipping point into this mind state of believing lies, believing delusions, and God has said, okay, you want to go that way, off you go. But then we see the result of that in all of this hatred, all of this anarchy, this rebellion, and all the rest that goes with it.
And Hugh, we've got to mention our own country as well, and we're in the midst of a general election, so I'll be a little bit careful with what I say. So the Conservative position is that Rishi Sunak has been very strong in his support and his friendship for Israel. Then he parachutes David Cameron in. David Cameron is effectively running all of the government's foreign policy. He was shocked by the horrors of what happened on October the 7th, but it's very quickly to say that Israel must stop fighting its war against Hamas in Gaza. He is called for a recognition of a Palestinian state. And then we also see, for example, the Labour Party, who look like they might form the next general election. Very similar policies, but the difference is they support the International Criminal Court's arrest warrant. This was said by David Lammy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary for Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel's Defense Minister. They've also said that they would come out and support a Palestinian state almost from day one, if I quote Claire Rayner. So it doesn't matter if it's the Conservatives or whether it's Labour. Our nation has to change, doesn't it, in our position towards Israel? One of our greatest allies in the Middle East. We share a great partnership in terms of trade and commerce, as well as the sharing of intelligence and military know-how, and that Britain needs Israel. This is not a way that Britain should act towards Israel by recognising a Palestinian state. Your thoughts?
Most definitely not. And I think the Conservative government could have been an awful lot stronger. The Conservative Party has been in total disarray since the pandemic, well, really even before the pandemic. And I've heard it said that Boris Johnson was prepared to consider moving the British embassy to Jerusalem. Now, and even Rishi Sunak did that. But now that David Cameron has come in, I don't think you can trust this man personally. And if Labour were to gain government in July, the left wing of the party is still very strong. I take my hat off to Keir Starmer for what he's done in trying to weed out anti-Semitism, and he's done a lot. But there is still this undercurrent in the left of the party, and as is the case with the Biden administration, one wonders how much the tail is going to wag the dog, so to speak, which is definitely happening across the pond. The left wing of the Democrat Party is certainly calling the shots as far as the Biden administration's policy towards Israel right now is concerned.
Can we just clarify something? It's Angela Rayner.
Angela Rayner, thank you.
Claire Rayner.
Yeah, Claire Rayner's agony. All right, yeah, got that right. So thank you for pointing that one out.
Okay.
Yes, of course, Angela Rayner, apologise. Talking about as Hugh was saying about the states and Joe Biden, I mean, it's quite extraordinary that we now have Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump, knowing that he's in a kind of big legal case, and we don't know the full implication of that yet of this recording, but has actually come out and stated that he's against a two-state solution now. If he were to become president in November, and actually implements that policy of not supporting a Palestinian state, we know that spiritually that would unleash an incredible blessing on the United States of America, because that would really be blessing Israel and not dividing or scattering the land of Israel and God's people, the Jewish people.
Yeah, beyond a shadow of a doubt. I mean, all three of us that are sitting in on this discussion this afternoon fully endorse Genesis 12 verse 3 and the warning of both blessing and cursing that goes along with how people and the nations treat Abraham and his descendants. So yes, if Donald Trump makes it into the White House, and I would personally say that that's a big if, but we shall see, and he does implement that policy, then it's a major plus, because there are so many other nations that take their cue from the White House. Maybe less than used to be, but nevertheless, there are significant nations who will at least take note of that policy statement.
So let's have a look at this CBN news report that reports on the fact that if President Trump wins the White House, or even able to contest the presidential election in November and actually wins that election, he said that he will not support a two-state solution. So let's have a look at this, which will be a game changer in terms of US foreign policy towards Israel. And the United States have never adopted this position, certainly since the Six-Day War of June 1967.
Rabbi Tuli Wise, thanks for joining us, founder of Israel 365. President Trump made news recently when he came out against the two-state solution. How significant is this?
Well, very significant. He would be the first American president to go against the conventional wisdom that has dominated the landscape for the last 30 years. It is it's very consistent with his other statements since the war began. President Trump has been very supportive of Israel, but what he said to Time magazine was very surprising. He said that he used to believe in the Palestinian state. He used to believe in a two-state solution, but he doesn't believe it anymore. And he's changed his mind in light of, frankly, the Palestinian community. The atrocity itself, the rampant support for the Hamas attacks from the population, not only in Gaza, but also throughout the Arab towns in Judea and Samaria.
And I also understand you wrote a letter, along with others, to Trump himself.
Right. We had formed a coalition called Keep God's Land, which is a coalition of faith leaders, Jewish and Christian, who are both opposed to the two-state solution, opposed to a Palestinian terror state, in support of Israel maintaining its sovereignty and settling the entire greater Israel, of Israel, Judea and Samaria, and Gaza. And as soon as the Trump's remarks were publicized, so we drafted a letter to thank President support for his moral clarity. We circulated it in the Jewish community. We circulated it in the Christian community outside, through the Keep God's Land coalition. And in just an hour, we had 100 signatures. I think we're up to about 400 signatures of faith leaders who are in gratitude to President Trump for changing his mind and revoking his support for the Palestinian state.
Yeah. Yet the Biden administration actually seems to be pushing for a two-state solution. Why do you believe a two-state solution is not what Israel should be doing right now?
Yeah, the Biden administration on October 8th and 9th was already reaffirming their commitment to the two-state solution as the only solution. A lot of people think, well, there is no alternative to the two-state. It is the solution. It's not true. There are alternatives. Ambassador David Friedman, who is a big part of the leadership of the Keep God's Land coalition, he has presented an alternative, a one Jewish state solution where Israel maintains sovereignty throughout Judea and Samaria. The two-state solution would reward terrorism, number one, and it would be a strategic and military nightmare for the state of Israel. The Palestinian state would be on our borders, on our neck, surrounding our airports, surrounding Jerusalem. But also from a biblical, spiritual point of view, this is not even our land. Doesn't belong to the Israeli people. The land of Israel belongs to God, and it's not ours to give it up. We must keep God's land.
Well, that's not. It's a point that a lot of people may not realize if they don't read the Bible. This land is also called the West Bank, but by most of the world, much of the media. And you had a declaration at the NRB in February. Tell us what that declaration was.
Well, Keep God's Lands came out with this new policy towards the media, and we worked very closely with the NRB, the National Religious Broadcasters, on encouraging Christian conservative media, also Jewish media, to refer to the territory by its rightful name, Judea and Samaria, and not by the inaccurate names of the occupied territories or the West Bank. So the NRB actually endorsed this resolution at their major conference of Christian communicators in Nashville, Tennessee in February. And the Keep God's Land Coalition has only been building momentum since that launch in February. We had a major event in Washington, D.C. recently where we had leading congressmen and women and senators also talking about their opposition, congressional opposition to a Palestinian terrorist state alongside, or what they would want instead of, Israel.
Okay. Well, Rabbi Tuly Wise, thanks for joining us here on CBN News.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
We have to acknowledge the great work being done by Chris Mitchell, the bureau chief in Jerusalem, and the whole team for CBN in their news and reporting of Israel. And I think that was an absolute gem to actually do a program, a short interview there about Donald Trump's decision to say that he no longer supports a two-state solution, which is a game changer for Israel. It's a game changer for the United States. This is a game changer, isn't it? The fact that here the first US president since the Six-Day War in June 1967 and the aftermath of that UN Resolution 242 that called for land for peace, which actually drafted by the British Foreign Office at the time. This is a game changer, isn't it? For a US president to say, I no longer believe in the two-state solution and I am against a Palestinian state, when we know that, for example, in January of 2020, then President Trump announced his big peace plan initiative that included a Palestinian state. Why do you think he's changed his mind?
I think October the 7th would have had a lot to do with it. But I think when you look at the record of, and I'm not talking about Hamas now, I'm talking about the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, who is supposedly Israel's peace partner. He's come to realize that a two-state solution is just not viable. And I would imagine he's come to realize too that the Palestinians are not willing, not prepared under any circumstances to live side by side in peace with Israel. Maybe he's become enlightened about the PLO Charter and the fact that you only need to look at the evidence with the pay for slay. It is still operating. I mean, I've been saying for years that the two-state solution is a sacred cow that actually needs to be both slaughtered and the carcass burnt. It's just a non-starter in every way, and I take my hat off to Donald Trump for actually coming out and saying this.
Yeah, and support for a two-state solution. Firstly, why call it a two-state solution? Because it sounds so much like the final solution, and of course this exact aim of the PLO, including Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Iranian regime, and Hezbollah, as well as ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the Houthis, any other Islamist terror organization you want to mention. But is the West so foolish that they think that everything is going to go away, the problem's going to be dissolved if Israel would only allow for the creation of a Palestinian state to live alongside Israel. And what would happen then? If they open up to elections, or there's a coup, or Mahmoud Abbas dies, Fatah are not going to get in. It'll be Hamas. And so Israel would then deal with, instead of dealing with Hamas in Gaza, deal with Hamas all along the strategic mountains of the Judean hills, overlooking Israel's airport, overlooking Jerusalem, being able to bomb and target every coastal city from Tel Aviv up to Haifa. And Israel would have a serious problem. Not only that, but also Jordan would be landlocked into a Hamas Palestinian state that would lead to the downfall. The Hashemite kingdom of Jordan replace Jordan with an Islamic extremist state. So is the world serious about the dangers of what a Palestinian state would actually look like on the ground if it was ever implemented?
I think the simple answer to your question, Simon, is yes. Because I think our problem in the West and the westernized nations is that we think we can solve things by sitting down around a table and talking about it, and maybe doling out the odd, grant here and there, and that's going to solve it all. And despite, as Hugh has pointed out, all of these years banging away at this two-state solution, it hasn't worked. And in the meantime, people are dying on both sides of this conflict, and no one seems to cotton on to the fact this is a dead duck. It's not going to work. It's never going to work, because you've got one side that doesn't want it to work. So?
No, absolutely. And Hugh, final words, final comments to you on this issue. And we're going to have to do Zoom calls in Australia now from now on, aren't we? Or Skype interviews.
Yes. Lance Lambert was a tremendous mentor of mine over many years. And I remember him once saying, when God wants to judge a nation or a group of nations, he sends their leaders mad. And I think we're seeing that.
Yeah.
Excellent. So Robin and Hugh, thank you so much for being my guests on this week's edition of the Middle East Report. And we've got to thank you, Hugh, for your hard work and your dedication to tell the truth of Israel's righteous cause through your wonderful documentaries like Whose Land, Forsaken Promise, and the many others you've done throughout the decades. And just to let you know, on behalf of all of us, including our viewers as well, you'll be very missed in the UK, but pray that God would use you powerfully in Australia. So thank you so much. And I want to thank you for watching this program at home. The whole concept of a Palestinian state is a non-starter. We know that this was only a terror stage in order for the Palestinian Authority, or the PLO, together with their friends Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, to destroy the one and only Jewish state. And this is God's land and he's sovereign. So I want to thank you for watching this week's edition of the Middle East Report.